I'm Jason Deere.
I'm Sammy G.
And we are Dice and Dragons. Please take a look at the video description below. There you will see our timestamps as well as some information as to what the video is about. So, stay tuned. It's coming up. Enjoy the show. What up, gamers? Today on Dice and Dragons, we apparently dressed for the wrong occasion. Instead of going to a galaxy far, far away, we are going out into the Expanse, something a lot closer than the galaxy of Star Wars. And it is a board game based on the fantastic novels by James S.A. Corey, as well as the TV series that you can catch on Sci-Fi or on Space if you're from the Great White North like the two of us here.
I thought we were doing Star Wars. My bad.
So what can you tell us about the game, Sammy G?
Well, first thing I can tell you is I know nothing about this series. Haven't read the books, haven't seen the TV show, but it is a worker placement game where you're trying to control the whole solar system. So that's quite cool. It is for 2 to 4 players. We recommend 4 players, and they say it takes around 60 minutes to play, but we have a sneaking suspicion if you're playing with 4 players, it could take maybe a little bit longer than that.
Yeah, I get the feeling that you're right on the money in that regards. The game was designed by Geof Engelstein, and it is published by Whiz Games. There is a little bit of a suspicion in the board game community, especially if you listen to any other podcast, that Geof probably adapted one of his other designs as something that he was working on for the universe of the Expanse. And from what we've seen so far, it looks like he did a pretty good job. I'm looking forward to getting into that political intrigue and Asabe joining the OPA. Don't need no UN, yeah? Gonna eat me some white kibble, red kibble? Live on a scrap ship, you know.
So we're going to take this to the table, and as always, we're going to grab our drink, grab whoever this guy is, and let's see how to play the Expanse.
Remember the Kent, and you're supposed to get me mushroom whiskey, man. Like, who drinks real beer in the belt?
Don't know the universe!
Now let's take a look at the components that come with the Expanse, the board game. This is just going to be a quick overview, and we'll get into a little bit more about the intricacies of the game and during gameplay, and we'll also explain the factions as we take a closer look at each faction. Hopefully this will provide you some insight and strategy for when you play the game. Now we have our 4 faction boards here, as well as the influence tokens for each faction, and you might notice that the UN actually has some larger cubes than the other factions. We'll talk about that because that goes with their special abilities. So blue is the UN, orange represents the MCRN, the Martian Congressional Republic, and you might notice that the Martians have these 2 battleships, which is their special ability. The OPA is white and has these 2 half ships, which are their scrap ships and is their special ability. While fans of the show may have a good suspicion as to what these 2 tokens are that Protogen has, those are the proto-molecule cards, and they are Protogen's special ability. Now you have the action deck right here, which you will use to fill the action track. And just to give you a little close-up of the action cards, you can see them right here. Some of them may be used by all factions, some only by certain factions. You can see what the action points they're worth up here, as well as the events that you may be able to activate. And we'll get into more detail about that when we go into gameplay. Here is the Rocinante board. Fans of the show know that is where the heroes are. So this is the hero board. The Rocinante is represented by this yellow token and has a variety of special abilities. And we'll explain who controls the Rocinante, how you can potentially control the Rocinante, and what effect it will have on the game. And finally, there are the bonus action tokens. Those are the last set of tokens that you're going to be using really to play the game. And these represent 1 sector on the board and are used during scoring. And actually, I'm noticing that I set something up here quite nicely, and I was almost forgetting about it. You have the initiative tokens here, and that is very important when it comes to gameplay, especially in a 3 or 4 player game and activating events. Now during a 2-player game, as you can see from the back of these initiative tokens, it's actually going to tell you what areas of the board are not available. So as you can see here, when you play a 2-player game, Io, Luna, Vesta, and the rings are not available, and the initiative tokens double for the purpose of serving as what they are, as well as for the blocking out of bases during a 2-player game. So now that we have reviewed the components, let's set some of this stuff aside and take a closer look at each of the factions and how you may want to play them. Now we're going to take a closer look at the UN. If you are playing the UN, you are going to set up your board following all of the instructions on this part of the card. After you've done that, you will flip the card over, and this will be the player board that you're using. Here is your starting technology, which in my opinion is very strong. In the upper right hand corner, you can see the base types that will benefit the UN when it comes to bonus scoring, and we'll explain what those resources are when we take a closer look at the game board. Now, the UN has 3 different technologies, and each of these technologies will become active at different phases in the game. Diplomats after the first scoring phase, Open Warfare after the second, and Hegemony after the third. So diplomats are very strong, and diplomats mean that you get access to the larger influence cubes, which represent 2 influence. You have Open Warfare, which means you may spend 2 action points to remove a fleet where you have a fleet. So you can essentially shoot down an enemy fleet. And with Hegemony, you win all ties, and that's very powerful during a scoring phase. The UN may control a total of 5 fleets, and that's really the overview of the faction. But just to give you guys a little bit more insight as to how they may play, let's take a look at some of the action cards that will be in service to the UN. So you've got the first one here, the Destruction of Deimos. So what you can do by using this event, if you are the UN or the OPA, you may remove 1 influence from each Mars base and place 1 of your influence on any Earth base. So you can really weaken Mars's control of itself, as well as strengthening your control in the Earth sphere. You have Bobby Draper, which works for the MCR or the UN. You may remove 1 opposing non-battleship fleet and place 1 of your fleets in the same orbital. So that basically kills 1 of the enemy fleets and gets you into position. And then finally, there are the stealth ships, which can be used by the UN or Protogen. So you may move a fleet up to 1 band, then remove it and remove up to 3 opposing fleets in the same orbital from no more than 2 players. So basically, you move 1 of your ships and you sacrifice it, to get rid of 3 opposing enemy fleets. That's a very strong card and only available to the UN and Protogen. So you can see that the UN is all about influence and control. And when it comes to the fleet, they are fairly strong, but they're not necessarily the strongest fleet. Next, we're going to take a look at the Martian Congressional Republic. So we'll take a look at the MCR, and you'll see how they differ from the UN faction. Now we're going to take a closer look at the MCR, or those of you fans of the show know as the MCRN, the Martian Congressional Republic. And you will once again follow the setup on the card, and you will set up your fleets and bases as per your faction sheet. Then you will flip the card over, and it will explain to you what your starting technology is. For Mars, it is the battleships, which count as 2 fleets instead of 1. Now you'll notice here in the right hand corner that in a 3-player game and a 4-player game, the resources that Mars is looking for will change, and that's something that you really want to pay attention to. Now let's take a look at Mars's technologies that will come into play as the scoring occurs. So the first thing is dominance, which happens after the first scoring phase, which means you win all orbital control ties, which can be very powerful. Next is open warfare. You may spend 2 action points to remove a fleet where you have a fleet. So essentially you can just shoot down another enemy ship. And then finally there is total war. You may spend 1 action point to remove a fleet where you have a fleet once per turn. So that is fairly powerful. And just to highlight the battleship as well, you can see the battleship is a 2. And if you flip it over here, it is a 1. So if a battleship is damaged, you do not immediately remove it. It will be damaged first and still count as 1 fleet instead of 2. Now let's take a look at what some action cards are that will help out the MCR. So one that is great for the MCR and the OPA is the Blockade of Earth, where you place 1 influence on an Earth base. If you have an Earth orbital control, you may also remove 1 influence on the Earth base. So you can see Mars is a lot about orbital control. Controlling the space is what they do best, and fans of the books and the show will know that's very thematic. You have the MCR and Protogen that can use this one. You can exchange the position of any 2 influence tokens, and that can be very good, especially if you're trying to infiltrate and be covert, which is also what Mars does a lot. And then finally, we're just going to look at Franklin the Graph. So these are the people that love Mars essentially, but also are on Earth. So this one will let you place 1 influence on 2 different bases in the Earth orbital. It also works for Protogen. So you can see that Mars gets a lot of its influence from its event, and its strength really lies in its fleets. So we're now going to take a look at the OPA. Now, before we take a closer look at the OPA, I just want to highlight something that I realized I did not do, which is the planning ability of the UN. So what this means is that the UN is able to buy cards from the first and second action slots at 0 control points, which is very good. I forgot to mention it because it's going to come up a lot in the gameplay, but I want to just highlight it now since we are taking a closer look at the factions. So we'll take a look at the OPA and their starting setup. You can see it right here. Let's not spend too much time on it. It's the same for every board. And here you can see what makes the OPA the OPA. So you have their technology, which is insurgency. As those of you that watch the show, read the books, know the OPA is growing in the outer planets, and this lets you spend 1 AP to put any influence in any location in the belt or the outer planets without a fleet. You can see in the right hand corner the resources that the OPA is looking for. Here you have their ships, including their half ships known as their scrap ships. So what are scrap ships? Well, let's take a look at the technology cards. So the OPA scrap ships, when you do, after the first scoring phase, when you gain this technology, you will take the 2 scrap ships. They count as 1 half ship for orbital control. So if you have both of them there, they count as 1 full ship. You may spend 1 AP to place or move a scrap ship to any orbital where you have influence. This is the only way you may move them. So scrap ships, since they are not well put together, they can only go where you currently have influence. You have open warfare as your second technology, where you basically can shoot down another fleet. It seems fairly standard for most factions. And then the final one where you get after the third scoring phase is rebellion, where you may spend 1 AP to remove an influence on any belt or outer planet location where you have an influence. So as you can see, the OP is very strong in the outer planets compared to the other factions, which is very thematic. Now let's just take a look at some cards that will benefit the OPA. So the first thing we have here is slingshot racing. So Mars can use this as well, which makes sense since they're both very much space-based organizations. Remove 1 influence from any outer planet's base. You then have Miller, where you can keep this card at no CP cost and discard to first perform the AP and then the eligible event on an action card on your turn. So you can really take the card and then save it to take both actions. So let's say, for example, you had Drummer. You could use the AP, the 3 AP from Drummer, and then perform 1 action point as well. So essentially you have 4 action points, which is kind of neat with this card because depending on how powerful the event card is and how much AP, it can really be a game changer. And if you notice, that's only good for the OPA and the UN, whereas Drummer is good for MCR and the OPA. So that just gives you a quick overview of the OPA. As you can see, they're very much an influential organization, but really limited into what they can do to the outer planets. So that's where you're going to really want to focus your influence. But you never know, depending on some cards and events, maybe you can get into the Earth Sphere. Now we'll take a look at Protogen. Now we're going to take a look at the final shadowy faction that is available when you play the 4-player version of the Expanse, Protogen. As with all the factions, you have your starting setup information on the back of your card. When you flip it over, it will tell you what your first and probably one of your best technologies is Puppet Master. I really like this one. You pay 0 to keep an event instead of 1 CP. That is something that no other faction can do and really gives you a little extra edge when manipulating the game from the shadows, as it would be. Now let's take a look at the other technologies that Protogen will have access to after the scoring phases, starting with Infiltration. This means you may spend 1 AP to replace 1 influence with your own, and you must have a fleet in orbit, which is great, you know. Corporate ship, no one's really paying attention to you. We're not sending a strike team that no one knows you have to take over the base. Open Warfare, just like all the other faction, it will let you shoot down enemy ships by spending 2 AP. And then you have finally the Proto-Molecule, which is probably the most different technology that there is. So what you would do is you would take the 2 Proto-Molecule tokens and place them on the card, meaning you can use this card twice. And what the card allows you to do is you would, instead of taking your regular action, you would spend your action and you may remove all influence in a base except your own. That is very powerful, especially when it comes to a scoring phase. Now let's take a look at some of the cards that affect Protogen. So you've got Kodiar Ghazi, and this isn't really a great Protogen card. You can keep this card at no CP cost, we can already do that. But what you can use for the event is when you're playing this during a scoring phase, you can look at the bonus token and take 2 AP worth of actions. So this actually gives you a little bit of an edge, especially if you combine it with the Proto-Molecule. If it's possible, I don't believe so though, but gives you an edge in the scoring phase. If you look at Anthony Dresden, this lets you place 1 influence on the 3 different tech bases. So as you can see from the top right hand corner, which I did miss this time, you can see the 2 technologies that Protogen is after. So that's a very good card for them. And finally you have Paulo Cortazar, which can also be used by the OPA, which lets you add or remove a total of up to 2 influence from outer planet bases. Now this is pretty cool because it really lets you gain influence in the outer planets, and that's an area where Protogen is fairly strong. I mean, it's a shadowy organization, and you're trying to conduct illegal research. What better place to do it than far away from Earth and Mars? And that's all the factions, but wait, there's one more board, so let's take a look at the heroes, the Rocinante. Now we finally come to the final board in the game, the hero board, the Rocinante. The Rocinante is represented by this yellow token and counts as 1 fleet for the player that controls the Rocinante. Now the Rocinante is controlled by the player with the lowest amount of control points, and it may change hands as you go into scoring phases. So after a scoring phase, if a new player has the least amount of control points, they will gain control of the Rocinante. Now what the Rocinante lets a player do is instead of making a regular action, i.e. spending action points or using an event, you may perform a Rocinante action, which means using one of the 4 powers that are available to you. James Holden would let you place 1 influence anywhere. Naomi Nagata lets you move the Rocinante 1 band and remove an opposing fleet that's there. Alex Kamal may move the Rocinante to any orbital, and Amos Burton would allow you to remove 1 opposing fleet in the Rocinante orbital for each friendly fleet there. So if the Rocinante was in an orbital with 4 of your ships, you could destroy up to 4 enemy ships. Something that could be very powerful in, let's say, a 3 to 4 player game. And that covers all of the boards. Let's take a look at how you play the Expanse. You've moved your fleets into position. Your agents are spread across the solar system, exerting your influence. This is the situation that we sit down to as we are now ready to play the Expanse. Now, during your turn, you're going to be trying to get the better of your political rivals as you strive to get the most control points by the end of the game. Now, if you do need a reminder as to how to go through a turn, which you're going to review in a second, don't hesitate to take a look at your faction card. You've got your turn explanation here, as well as a summary as to what you can spend your action points on. Now, there are 3 ways that you can start your turn in this game. The first way is going to be taking an action from the action track, and then you can either spend the action points from the action, or you can choose to use the event if your faction symbol is on the card. Now, the other thing that you can do would be to play a saved event. Now, this is obviously not available at the start of the game, but you can do this as of your second turn. And depending on the faction that you are, you may or may not have to spend a control point to save an action. The only faction I believe that doesn't have to spend a control point for any action that they would like to save is Protogen. Now, one of the reasons that you may want to save an action is that's where the game gets juicy. That's where all of the strategy on the complication comes in. By saving actions, you're able to limit how your opponents interact with certain cards, as well as put yourself in a great position to get some massive points during a scoring phase. Now, the third way that you can interact with the game is by using the Rocinante instead of playing an action or from the track or using a saved action. Now, the Rocinante starts with the 4th player, and after the first scoring round, it will be controlled by the player in last place. Those players would then have the option of using a Rocinante action and using one of the crew's special abilities instead of drawing an action from the action track or playing one of their saved actions. Now, just to show you guys a little bit how the game is going to be played, why there's this nice initiative track here, I'm going to go through the game as Protogen, and then we'll just cover what the MCR would do. I think that'll give you a good idea of how to play the game, and then after that we will go through a scoring phase. So as Protogen, I'm going to take the first available action card, and I could choose to do the event, but I really am after the action points right now. For 0 control points, it's the start of the game. 3 action points is a great way to start. I just want to highlight, though, that as this card can also be used by the MCR, I am now giving them the opportunity to potentially do this event as I am taking action points. So the way this part works in the game is that if you choose action points over the event, all of the other players may choose to enact the event, and the way you decide that is by going down the initiative track. So in this case, the OPA would get first shot at enacting the event. However, they are not able to on the Riot Gear card as their faction is not listed on the card. So after you've taken the action card, you're going to slide all of the cards down 1 on the track and draw a new card and add it to the track. As I've decided to take action points, I do have a couple of opportunities available to me now. So you can take a look at your faction card, and you can spend each point on any one of the things that are available to you, and you can even do that multiple times. So let's say I want to expand my influence by placing 1 influence cube where I have a fleet. I can do that 3 times, once for each action point. And as you can see here in Saturn, I don't have any influence cubes, so I could decide to place an influence cube on the rings, gaining control of that base, at least momentarily. Now, the other thing that I can do in this scenario would be move my fleets either 1 orbital in the same band. In the Expanse, you can see there are 3 bands, the inner planets, the belt, and the outer planets. Or I can move a fleet or a fleet group into a different band. So I can, for example, take 1 ship and move it from Thoth to Eros, from Thoth to Saturn, from Thoth to Mars or Earth. I can also move this ship to Jupiter or any of the other locations in the belt. I just didn't show that because it's a little bit far away. Now I can also move a fleet group. That means I can move any number of ships that are in the same orbital. So I can move 2 ships from Thoth to Mars, 2 ships from Thoth to somewhere else in the belt. I can even move over into Earth and try to gain control of the Earth sphere. Or I can move these 2 ships into the outer planets, gaining orbital control over Saturn. And those are the options that are available to me with my action points. I can also save the event to use it later on, which might not be a bad idea for Protogen because I can remove 2 influence on up to 2 belt bases, no more than 1 per base. So that could be a very powerful play during a scoring phase because, oh, well, you know what? I'm going to hold off on that. I'll explain it a little bit more in the scoring phase. But suffice it to say, it's going to give you a lot more opportunity to get points by weakening your opponents. So actually, instead of taking the action points, I'm going to save this card. Now let's take a look at what the MCR might want to do on their turn. Well, some of the better cards right now are a little bit further down the track, and being that Mars is largely space-based, spreading out their influence is typically a good idea for the start of the game. That's what we found out with a couple of playthroughs that we've done. So I'm going to go ahead and take the Black Ops team, which is going to cost Mars 2 control points. I would then adjust my control points on the track. And then I have access to the 4 AP, or I can do the event, remove 1 influence from up to 3 bases, each in a different band. That's a very powerful card, but I want to spread out my influence right now, so I'm going to put 1 influence cube wherever I have a fleet. And right now, Saturn seems a nice place to start building, so I'll place a cube in the rings and on Titan. I will also try to get control of Jupiter by placing influence on Ganymede and Io. Now, what you can see right here is the UN or Protogen now has the opportunity to use this event card as I did not do it. And this is when the initiative track comes into play. The OPA would have first choice. They're not on the card though. They can't do it, meaning that the UN can decide to use the event. Now this is very important because it's part of the strategy of the game, because if the UN lets it pass and Protogen then decides to use the event, they can use it to strike at any player, not just the player that is using the action points that took the card. What that would mean, for example, is let's say the UN passes, Protogen could then decide that they're going to weaken the Earth bases by removing 1 influence from Africa and Rhea. So in this situation, if you are the UN, you're probably going to want to do the event yourself. So in that case, you would move the UN down the initiative track, sliding everyone else up, and that's what it's used for. It's used to determine which player gets the first opportunity to enact an event when a player decides to use action points instead of the event. And what would the UN player do at this point? Probably take a strike right back at Mars, as Mars just expanded their influence by 4 bases, and remove a cube on Io and Titan. Now we can't remove any other influence cubes in the outer planets. It has to be another band. So why don't we strike them at the heart of their territory and hit them where it hurts on Mars? And that's how you're going to be playing the game. Players are going to be going back and forth, taking actions, spending their action points, and using the events on the card, as well as using, don't forget you have these, your special abilities, your technologies that are going to come into play as the scoring phases come up. Now we're going to cut right here, and we're going to take a look at how you score in the Expanse, because that's where the game also gets a little bit more meaty. You can take a look at the scoring track here, and as you can see, the more scoring rounds occur, the bigger and juicier those points get. So you really want to make sure that you're planning ahead. You might lose out in the first round, but as you can see with the nice 5, 3, and 1 here, you can make big comeback in the later stages of scoring. Stay tuned. We took our shot at weakening our opponents, and while we did have some success, we were also weakened as well. And we are now ready to get into scoring in the Expanse. What I do want to highlight here is something that is very important during the course of the game. These are the resources that your faction is looking for. So in this case, Protogen, they are looking for minerals and tech. When you look at the MCR, who is actually quite interesting, in a 3-player game, they are looking for water and minerals. In a 4-player game, it's water and tech. As this is a 4-player setup, they would be looking for water and tech. When you have control of the bases that you are looking for that are a specific resource, you do get an extra point. And don't forget, you can always reference the rulebook for some clarification. You can see the 4 types of resources here: food, water, minerals, and tech. Now, I'm going to be playing this from the point of view of the Protogen player, just to show you how you would go over scoring. We'll also explain what happens if there happens to be a tie, and let's get into that right now. What up, gamers? Future Jason here, coming at you to save you from my younger, dumber self. Now, I'm about to tell you that you need to reveal the bonus sector at the start of scoring. Don't do it. It's not the way you're supposed to play the game. The correct way to play the game is that after each player has had an opportunity to either play a saved action, or if they control the Rocinante, use one of the crew abilities, the last player, so the player that started scoring, would play their saved event, and then they would reveal the bonus sector and then initiate scoring. Everything else is correct in the video. I just realized it while I was putting it all together and wanted to stop you from getting completely derailed while you play the game. So I'm going to take off and let you get back to watching that younger, cuter version of me. So as a Protogen player, I would reveal the bonus sector. In this case, that is the inner planets, meaning that all other areas would follow normal scoring, whereas the inner planets would follow the bonus scoring, which means that the first place player gets 2 points, second place would get 1, and third place would get 0. Now, if you look at the latter half of the game, the third place player can get some points, meaning sneaking an influence in under someone's nose can be very useful at gaining some extra points and maybe just clinching you that victory depending on how tight the race is at the end of the game. Now, one thing I do want to stress is that if there is a tie in a normal scoring sector, you're not going to get any points. So tying is really not a good thing unless you are in a bonus sector, because there's still an opportunity to get some points. What happens is that when you tie, you go down to the next tier. So for example, in Europa, as no one has control, both players would get 0 points. Now, if, for example, the outer planets, let's see if I can find the token here, had been the bonus sector, that means that as it's a tie, both players would get still 1 control point. So tying in normal areas is not a good thing. And there is also a way to avoid ties by having orbital control. Now, the way that works is by having more ships in the orbital than your opponents. So when you look at Saturn and Jupiter right now, no one actually has orbital control, meaning no one's going to be getting control of Europa or Rhea, even though they are contested. However, when you look over at the Earth sphere, the Earth orbital, Protogen is 2 ships to the UN's 1, meaning they actually count as an extra influence on Eurasia, which would give them control of Eurasia. So let's just go through the scoring here quickly and show you how we'd rack up all these points. So in the outer planets, Europa would score as nothing. You would get 1 point for Ganymede for the MCR. No bonus points because they're not looking for that resource. The UN would score well for Io because they get 1 point for Io, as well as 1 bonus point because that's one of the resources they are looking for. And that's how you would score things in the normal area. I'm not going to go through everything in the belt except for Tycho and Toss Station because they're rather interesting. Now in Tycho, it's even in terms of fleets. There is one OPA ship to one UN ship. Or is it? The OPA controls the Rocinante, which also counts as a fleet, giving them orbital control of Tycho, meaning that they would come in first place for that extra influence, and they would then score for Tycho. And when you look at Toth right here, there's only 2 ships, but it's a Martian battle cruiser, which counts as 2, meaning that Mars is actually going to score for Toth. And that's actually really good for Mars because this is a tech base. They're going to get 2 points for having control of Toth. Now we're going to get into the bonus scoring. So when you look at Earth right now, Protogen controls Eurasia. They do not control Africa because of some nice moves by the UN player. They also control Luna, and MCR's got a stranglehold on their home base of Mars. So in this case, the UN would score nothing for, they're going to score 1 for Eurasia as they're coming in second. There is no ties. And Protogen's going to score first for 2 points. The UN's going to score 2 on Africa. Protogen will score 2 on Luna. And in the case here, as there's no contestation, MCR is just going to rack up a whole lot of points for Mars. So in retrospect, maybe Protogen shouldn't have picked the inner planets. They're not in as good of a situation as the other players. That covers how you do scoring, but don't forget there is one other major thing that occurs after the first scoring phase is you get your first tech card. So your tech cards can be used in addition to your starting technology. In the case of Protogen, they would gain infiltration. MCR would gain dominance. You can't quite see it over there, but the UN would gain their diplomats and the OPA would gain their scrap ships. Now the game goes on and on in this fashion until the 6th scorecard shows up. So what happened is, let's say we've gone through all of this bonus scoring phases. It happens to be Protogen's turn. They've taken the card, decide to keep it, and then redraw the deck. Well, I'm just going to take a look for a scorecard here. So if the scorecard was the card that came up, you immediately go into scoring. That's it. There's nothing else that occurs. You are now in the scoring phase, and you'll be working towards ending the game, and the bonus sector will be whatever bonus sector is left remaining. And that is how you play the Expanse. Stay tuned now for our review of the game. Now, before we get on to the review of the game, there's just one quick addendum I wanted to add, and that is the scorecard, which you can see here is quite helpful. It details everything that you need to do during a scoring phase. So if you happen to forget, you don't need to consult the rule book. Just take a look at the card. With that, let's get on to our review of the game.
So we played a couple of rounds of the Expanse. You guys know now how to play the game. And sitting here in this room, it's not so much of an Expanse, but what do you think of it?
Well, I gotta say, playing for the times we played as the MCRN, I gotta say I was definitely disappointed in the 2-player version of the game. I think the MCRN was built to take advantage of orbital control and being able to get extra influence. However, it may have been the action cards that we got, but there was a couple times in a row. I just felt that I would always have to be using action points, and that was opening up a lot of opportunities for Sammy G to be taking advantage of events, and I didn't want that to happen, and I just kind of got bogged down. I was able to destroy a lot of his fleets, and the fleet control was really cool, but it didn't really feel like it was working with the two of us going head-to-head, especially with a lot of stuff missing from the game, as you saw during our explanation of how to play.
That's it. So, I mean, in the 2-player game, you're forced to take out the UN or the MCRN. Whoever takes the UN, 99% of the time you're going to win. Your influence gets spread out quite quickly, and even though I had no fleet because kept blowing it up, it didn't really matter at the end of the day. I had enough influence that for when a scorecard came up, I would just play it right away regardless of the cost, and I would run away because, again, it doesn't feel balanced, and winning didn't feel great. It was too easy almost.
No, it kind of felt a little bit like base influence trumped orbital control. Then you had that extra free spot on the board, and just momentum was easily the shift in one direction, and that just wasn't fun.
But that being said, with the two-player game, you're also losing out on strategic elements like the influence track that's gone. There's in a 3-4 player game, there's different resources attributed to the certain bases, and that will give you extra bonus points. There's second, third place bonus points that you can get when you're doing the scoring, and you kind of lose out on all that in the design.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we really didn't like because the game is clearly designed for 4-player. The initiative track, which Sammy referred to as the influence track, is something that adds a lot of strategy. The ability to potentially use somebody else's event. The fact that you are guaranteed almost with 4 players to have an opportunity to use somebody else's event is going to drastically change the game. And that's something that we just did not find happening in a 4-player game. And just to speak a little bit more about the design, this is a very well designed worker placement and area control game. Getting influence and understanding how to move across the board, build up your influence, and gain control of zones was not too difficult. And I really want to tip my hat off to the designer Geof Engelstein. He did a great job on that, and I really want to try it as a 4-player game. I think you agree with me on that.
I absolutely do. It's great design. Components, not so much. It's a little bit on the cheap side. I think we played this, as I said, a few times, and the board's kind of coming apart already.
It's unglued. It was kind of like that when we took it out of the box. Whiz kids, I gotta say, I'm quite disappointed in that. The cards, you use the good card stock for the cards, but the cardboard and the cardboard components, they're not great. I'd expect a little bit more, especially at the price we're seeing the game retail at least here in Canada. It might not be as bad in the US.
Maybe not.
Not sure, but it is a well-designed game, and I guess we're really paying for the design and for Geof Engelstein, who's really known to design fantastic worker placement games.
So what would you base it off of? Because I'm a little bit cautious when I'm going to give it a score, but I'm curious about what you would rank it.
So I want to give the game a design score. This is not something that we typically do on Dice & Dragons, but in terms of how easy it was to play, simple, and the real potential I can see for fun, I'm going to give the design a 7. And that is just based on reading the rules and playing the 2-player version of it. Now, if I was just reading the 2-player version, that score would be much lower, but I'm looking at the overall design of the game, and just note that score may go higher. Don't be surprised if you see Sammy G and me sitting down and giving you guys a 3 to 5 minute review after playing it as a 4-player game. And then as a 2-player game, I gotta give it a 5, only because I like the Expanse, I like the setting. Sometimes it's fun to play from a more challenged position, so if you are the stronger gamer in your household, maybe you want to play as the MCRN and have somebody else play as the UN, but it's just decent, it's okay, and it's not something I would ever recommend.
Is it based for me on how overpowered the UN felt? Seemingly, maybe again you played the MCRN wrong, but I don't think we're the only ones that felt that the UN is quite overpowered. But that being said, you're very generous, my friend, because as a 2-player game, and remember, my ranking is just for the 2-player game because that's all I know right now. 2, 3 out of 10. It's not great. I said I won, but it just didn't feel great. It was too easy. So I don't like it that much as a 2-player game. I don't like the fact that it kind of makes me... It doesn't force me to go and look at different strategies that we can use in the game. Not having that influence track, whether I should take the action points, whether I should play the event, whether I should... I like to be kind of pushed to my intellectual limit, and you don't get that in the 2-player game. So as a 2-player game, as I said, 2 on 10, 3 on... let's call it a 2.5 on 10.
No, I can see your point. I think I might be giving it a higher score because I played the MCRN for all the times. I got really frustrated after the first game and wanted to see if there was a way for me to play better, and you just played every time as the UN. And I mean, your strategy was very simple, was block me from getting the opportunity to use the events that showed up. And because you're not using the full deck of cards in the two-player scenario, there really was some limitations. I mean, maybe you could house rule it and take a look at it yourself after playing it a lot, but that's generally not a good sign when we're saying make some house rules to play a official version of a game. So I think that goes to show you where we stand on this, unless you've got anything else you'd like to add.
No, just if you guys want to see us play the 4-player game, we will absolutely revisit it. Please comment below. And of course, from us at Dice and Dragons, thank you so much for watching. As always, grab your drink, grab your buddy, and go explore outer space.
Yeah, go explore the Expanse. Don't get lost in the belt. Lots of weird stuff out there. Proto-molecules, aliens, well...
Asteroids. Many asteroids. Yeah, you know.
And don't forget, series. That's where you go for a good time. Series.
Maybe mark that down. Vespa. EO? Yeah. EO.
No, IO is, I think they got food. No, research. Research is on IO.
Good to know.
Just takes you 2 months to get there.
That is a bitch.
Yes, it is. Warp drive, please.
Hey, thanks very much for watching, guys. If you like what you saw, as always, please comment. Please subscribe. Won't cost you any gold, XP, willpower, nothing. It doesn't cost you anything.
Yes, and if you'd like to follow us to get some more information about when there'll be some new videos and what our upcoming content might be, please follow us on Twitter at dice_and_dragons. You can find us on Facebook at Dice and Dragons Games. We like to interact with our fans, so please head on over and comment. And then you can see some pictures as to maybe what game's coming up at Dice and Dragons on Instagram. And if that's a little bit complicated, don't worry. We included all that information down below in the video description.
So you might see about now some other links to our other content. It's, again, free for you guys. We love what we do. And as always, grab a drink, grab your buddy, keep playing games.
Keep playing games.